This story is titled, My Stepbrother Stole His Own College Fund and Framed Me for It, Making My Entire Family Disown Me. What's up, guys? Let me share the drama that blew up my whole life. I didn't think I'd ever put this out there, but a friend of mine suggested posting here to see other perspective. So, here goes. My 26 male dad passed away when I was 10. It was rough. Just me and my mom left to figure things out. For those first couple of years, it was like we were in survival mode together. We were close, like best friends. She was my rock, my biggest supporter, and honestly, the only reason I got through losing my dad. Then my mom met that guy named Paul at some work conference, and it was like things went from 0 to 60 overnight. Within 6 months, they were married, and we had a whole new family dynamic. I wasn't thrilled about it, but Paul seemed okay at first. He was polite, kept his distance, and seemed to genuinely make my mom happy. Seeing her smile again after everything we'd been through felt like a good enough reason to give the guy a chance. Paul's son Eric was 10, same age as me, and when he moved in with us, my whole life flipped. From day one, it was clear Eric wasn't down with this new family setup. I get it. Having your parent remarry is a big deal. But Eric wasn't just adjusting. He acted like my mom and I were invaders in his life. It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long to realize this kid was trouble. Eric had this way of making himself look like the victim in every situation. He'd mess up the house and blame me, eat all the snacks I'd saved for later, and then lie about it with the straightest face you've ever seen. He broke a lamp playing tag inside the house and told Paul I'd pushed him. Another time, he ate the leftover birthday cake my mom had saved for me and swore he'd seen me eating it the night before. Every time, Paul believed him without question. To Paul, Eric was the golden boy who could do no wrong. What really pissed me off, though, was how Eric went out of his way to mess with my mom. He'd lie about stuff I supposedly said or did, trying to make her think I was some kind of bully. Alex yelled at me when you weren't home, he'd say. Or, Alex said he doesn't like living here anymore. It was all total BS, but Paul ate it up, and it started to wear on my mom. It reached a point where it started to drive a wedge between Paul and my mom. Every time Paul believed one of Eric's lies, it led to late-night arguments I could hear from my room. But my mom at first had always been my biggest defender, but after a while she started to second-guess herself. She didn't want to fight with Paul, so she'd just tell me to ignore Eric and let it go. Easy to say when you're not the one being blamed for everything. Things got worse as we got older. Eric leveled up from annoying little brother vibes to full-blown chaos. By middle school, he was the type of kid who'd skip class, trash his homework, and blame the teachers for his bad grades. In high school, he found a group of friends who were all about breaking rules and partying. They'd cut school, vandalize stuff, and throw house parties whenever their parents were out of town. And of course, Eric found a way to make me look like I was part of it. If he got caught doing something dumb, he'd say I was the one who started it. If a teacher called Paul about Eric skipping class, Eric would say, Alex skipped first, so I thought it was okay. I wasn't skipping anything. I was either in class or at work at my part-time job at a bookstore. But Paul didn't care about facts. He just wanted to keep his golden boy happy. He'd punish both of us, to be fair, even though I had nothing to do with it. By the time we were juniors in high school, I'd given up trying to clear my name. It didn't matter how much proof I had. Paul always found a way to spin it like I was the bad guy. You're just better at hiding what you do, he'd say. My mom would defend me sometimes, but Paul would shut her down with, you're just biased because he's your son. Over time, she started picking fewer battles, and I couldn't even blame her. The whole house was a war zone, and Paul and Eric had all the power. So I stayed out of their way. I focused on school, worked my part-time job, and spent as much time as I could at my best friend Jake's house. Jake was my safe space. He'd seen Eric's crap firsthand, and was the only person who really understood what I was dealing with. That kid's gonna crash and burn one day, Jake used to say. I hoped he was right, but I didn't think I'd still be around to see it when it happened. Meanwhile, Eric's life was going off the rails. His grades were trash, and he barely graduated high school. He didn't get into any colleges, which pissed Paul off to no end. Not because Eric had screwed up, but because it made Paul look bad. Meanwhile, I got into a solid state school with a partial scholarship. I worked hard for that, and it felt like my one big win. But of course, Eric acted like it was a personal attack on him. You think you're so much better than me now, huh? He'd say, whenever college came up. Must be nice to have everything handed to you. The audacity of this guy was unreal. I worked my ass off for that scholarship, while he had a literal $80,000 college fund sitting in the bank, untouched because he couldn't even get into a community college. By the time we were both out of high school, Eric had somehow managed to coast through life without facing any real consequences. It wasn't because he didn't screw up. He screwed up a lot, But whenever he got caught, he had a knack for twisting the story and making it seem like someone else was to blame. And 9 times out of 10, that someone else was me. Let me give you an example of Eric's genius-level manipulation. During his so-called gap year, which was really just an excuse to sit around playing video games and hanging out with his deadbeat friends, Eric decided he wanted to turn over a new leaf. At least, that's what he told Paul and his grandparents. He fed them some sob story about how he was finally ready to focus on his future and make them proud. It was a crock of shit, but they ate it up. Paul even gave him access to the office computer to start researching colleges and scholarships. Big mistake. A few months into his gap year, Paul noticed that the printer kept running out of paper and ink way faster than usual. When he asked Eric about it, Eric said he'd been printing out college applications and study guides. That should have been a red flag right there. Eric didn't even have the grades to apply to most colleges, let alone the ambition to study. But Paul believed him, as usual. With all these incidents piling up, the real trouble started 4 years ago. Let me break it down for you. Remember the $80,000 college fund I mentioned earlier? Eric's grandparents had set it up for him when he was born. That money was supposed to be his golden ticket to a brighter future. A huge opportunity just sitting there, waiting for him to do something meaningful. Except Eric wasn't exactly the make something of yourself type. He'd spent most of high school barely scraping by and didn't get accepted to any decent colleges. His grandparents weren't thrilled, but they decided to let him use the money for community college, with the understanding that if his grades were good, he could transfer to a 4-year school. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, Eric didn't think so. In his mind, the money wasn't an investment in his education. It was a blank check for him to live his best life. He'd been dipping into the fund during his gap year. Small amounts at first, just enough to cover new clothes, gadgets, and whatever else caught his eye. But as time went on, the withdrawals got bigger. By the time Paul noticed, the account was almost empty. This is where things get insane. Instead of owning up to it, Eric decided to shift the blame onto me. He told Paul that I'd been sneaking into his office, where he kept all the important documents, and that I'd stolen the account details to transfer the money to myself because I was jealous that he had a college fund. He even claimed to have seen me acting suspicious around the office on multiple occasions. Now, let me just say this. I didn't even know where Paul kept his office documents, let alone how to access Eric's college fund. I'd never touched that account, and I didn't need to. I had my own scholarship, a part-time job, and a clear plan for my future. Why would I risk everything to steal from a kid who barely passed high school? But Eric didn't stop there. He knew how to play the game. He created fake evidence, emails that looked like they came from me, asking about transferring large sums of money. He even planted a USB drive in my room with what he claimed were screenshots of the account and instructions on how to access it. It was the most elaborate setup I'd ever seen, and honestly, I have to give him credit. The guy went all in. When Paul confronted me, I was blindsided. He called me into the living room, where Eric was already sitting, looking all smug and self-righteous. My mom was there too, but she looked more confused than anything else. Paul didn't waste time. "Alex," he said, "I need to know why you did this." I had no idea what he was talking about. "Did what?" I asked, genuinely clueless. That's when Eric chimed in, all fake concern and dramatic pauses. "I didn't want to believe it, Alex," he said, like he was doing me a favor by pretending to be hurt. "But I saw you. I saw you going through Dad's office. And then the money started disappearing." Paul cut him off and started laying out the evidence. The fake emails, the planted USB drive, even screenshots of the supposed transaction. I was stunned. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing you couldn't do anything to stop it. I still remember this in detail. I tried to defend myself, desperate to make them see reason. Check the bank records. Talk to the bank. File a police report. Do anything to prove I didn't do this. I don't even know how to access the account. But Eric had planned everything too well. The fake evidence was flawless, leaving no room for doubt, and Paul accepted it without hesitation. I turned to my mom, silently begging her to defend me, to step in and stop this madness. She just stood there, her face full of tears, looking at me like I was someone she didn't recognize. Finally, she spoke. "I'm so disappointed in you. I can't believe you would do something like this." Those words cut through me like a knife. "Mom, you know me," I said, trying to keep steady. "You know I didn't do this. You know I wouldn't." She didn't respond. She just shook her head, her eyes avoiding mine. Paul stepped forward, glaring at me. "This doesn't surprise me. You've always been jealous of Eric, haven't you? From the moment you came into this house, you've been nothing but trouble. And now, you think you can steal from us? From your own family? I've had enough." I tried to argue again, desperate for someone to listen, but Paul cut me off with a wave of his hand and yelled at me, "Pack your things, you're done here. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying in this house another second. You've got 30 minutes to leave. If you're not gone by then, I'll call the cops." I froze for a moment, looking back at my mom, hoping she'd say something, anything, but she just stood there, silent, her arms crossed tightly as if she was trying to hold herself together. Her silence hurt more than Paul's words ever could. Eric stood off to the side, looking like he was trying to appear upset. "I just can't believe you do this to me," he said, shaking his head like he was the victim. It was sickening. I almost stormed at him, smashing that fucking face, wiping that a smug smirk. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and headed upstairs, my steps heavy as I went to pack. Throwing my things into a duffel bag, I felt a mix of anger, frustration, and heartbreak. This wasn't just about being kicked out. This was about my mom, the one person who was supposed to stand by me, choosing not to. She wasn't saying anything. She wasn't doing anything. She was just letting it happen. When I came back downstairs, Paul was standing by the front door, watching me like a guard, making sure I wouldn't try anything. My mom stood a few steps behind him, her face streaked with tears, but she still didn't say a word. I slung the bag over my shoulder, pausing for a moment as I looked at her, hoping she'd stop this somehow. She didn't. She just stood there, letting it all happen. As I stepped out the door, Eric muttered behind me, "I just can't believe he'd do this." That was it. No one was going to listen. No one was going to stand up for me. I realized then that I was completely on my own. I walked out of that house with a duffel bag, and nowhere to go. I felt like my entire life had been ripped out from under me. I was 22, had just finished college, and was suddenly homeless. My family, the people who were supposed to have my back, had turned on me because of a lie. I had nothing. No home, no support, and no idea what came next. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't going to let Eric or Paul destroy me. Thank God for my best friend, Jake. The second I called him, he told me to come over. I don't know what I would have done without him. Jake had been my rock during all the years of dealing with Eric's crap, and now he was there to help me pick up the pieces. He didn't ask a lot of questions, just handed me a blanket and said, "Stay as long as you need." That first week was rough. I was still working part-time at a bookstore, but my hours barely covered food, let alone rent. I had some savings from my part-time jobs during college, but it wasn't much. Every night, I'd crash on Jake's couch and try not to think about how my own mom had let this happen. Every morning, I'd wake up, head to work, and pretend like everything was fine. But inside, I was a mess. But the worst part was that my mom didn't call. Not once. I tried reaching out a couple of times, but she didn't pick up. Not even once. It didn't take long to figure out that Paul had probably blocked my number. I kept telling myself she'd reach out eventually, but deep down, I started to accept that maybe she wouldn't. It hurt like hell, but I didn't have the luxury of wallowing. I had to figure out how to move forward. After about a month of sleeping on Jake's couch, I got lucky. My manager at the bookstore mentioned an opening for an entry-level IT job at her husband's company. It was steady work, and it paid better than the bookstore. I applied, and to my surprise, I got the job. That was the start of my climb. I took every opportunity to prove myself. I stayed late, volunteered for extra training, and soaked up as much knowledge as I could. It wasn't easy. I was balancing a new job, my lingering anger at my family, and the reality of being on my own for the first time. But I refused to let Eric's lies define me. After a couple of months, I saved up enough to rent a tiny studio apartment. I finally had a place where I felt like I could breathe. Jake helped me move in. And when we were done, he said, "See, you're already doing better than half the people I know." Having my own space made a huge difference. It gave me room to think and focus on my goals. In the meantime, I completely cut off contact with my family. I blocked Paul and Eric on social media and stopped trying to call my mom. It wasn't an easy decision, but I realized that holding on to hope was only dragging me down. If they wanted to believe Eric's lies, fine. I wasn't going to waste any more energy trying to change their minds. Over the next couple of years, I landed a new job at a tech firm with better pay and benefits. The certifications I'd been working on paid off, and I got promoted to a project coordinator position within 6 months. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually getting somewhere. But even as I moved forward, the scars from what happened didn't fade. Every time I achieved something, I couldn't help but think about how my family wasn't there to see it. My mom, who had always been my biggest supporter, didn't even know I'd landed a great job or moved into a better apartment. It stung, but I reminded myself that this was the life they'd chosen by believing Eric over me. Speaking of Eric, I didn't hear much about him during those years, But what little I did hear didn't surprise me. Jake occasionally ran into people from our old town who mentioned him, and the stories were always the same. Eric was still job hopping, blaming everyone else for his failures, and mooching off Paul. Apparently, he'd even blown through the last of his college fund on a failed business venture. Classic Eric. By the time 4 years had passed, I was in a solid place. I was a project manager at my tech firm, making more money than I'd ever thought possible. I'd bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood. But life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. Just when I thought I'd finally left my family's mess behind, Eric found a way to drag me back in. Jake got a call one day from an unknown number. He didn't think much of it at first, probably a spam call or something. But when he picked up, it was Eric. Apparently, Eric had been trying to track me down for weeks. He'd gone to my old workplace, reached out to mutual friends, even tried messaging me on LinkedIn. Jake ignored him at first, but then Eric told him why he needed to talk to me. His 2-year-old daughter had a heart condition, and she needed surgery. Eric was desperate, and I was his last hope. When Jake told me, my first reaction was anger. After everything Eric had done, he had the nerve to ask me for help? But then Jake showed me a picture of a little girl hooked up to machines. But I didn't want to get involved. I told Jake to tell Eric to figure it out himself, but Jake wouldn't let it go. Look, man, he said, I know Eric's a piece of trash, but this kid's innocent. She didn't ask for any of this. Are you really going to let her suffer because of him? I hated that Jake was right. That girl didn't deserve to pay for Eric's mistakes. But if Eric thought I was going to swoop in and save the day without making him face the consequences, he didn't know me as well as he thought. So I agreed to meet him, but I did it on my terms. We met at my office, a place where I was in control. I wanted him to see just how far I'd come since he'd tried to destroy me. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. The cocky, entitled stepbrother I remembered was gone. In his place was this wreck of a guy who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and he had dark circles under his eyes. The second I closed the door, he broke down. I'm talking full-on tears, falling to his knees, begging me to help him. He told me he'd tried everything, crowdfunding, selling his car, even going to distant relatives for help. He'd managed to scrape together about $30,000, but he was still $70,000 short. Without the surgery, Mia's condition would keep getting worse, and the doctors weren't sure how much time she had left. I know I don't deserve your help, he said, choking on his words. But this isn't about me. It's about Mia. Please, Alex. You're her only hope. I let him talk. I let him plead and cry and tell me his sob story. Then, when he finally ran out of things to say, I told him my terms. If he wanted my help, he had to confess everything to the family. Every lie, every manipulation, every time he'd blamed me for something he'd done. He had to tell the truth about the college fund, how he stole it and framed me, and he had to do it in front of everyone. The color drained from his face. Alex, please, he said. I'll do anything else. I'll pay you back. I'll sign a contract. Just don't make me do that. I didn't budge. No confession, no money, I said. Take it or leave it. He tried to bargain. He begged me to reconsider. He even offered to make a public apology on social media instead of facing the family. But I stood firm. I wasn't interested in his shortcuts or half measures. If he wanted me to help his daughter, he was going to have to take responsibility for what he'd done. After what felt like forever, he finally agreed. Okay, he said. I could barely hear him. I'll do it. I made it clear that I wasn't just taking his word for it. You arrange the family meeting, I said. You tell them the truth, and only after you've done that will I transfer the money. Directly to the hospital, not to you. He nodded, looking like he wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. As he left, he tried to apologize again. I'm sorry, Alex, he said, for everything. I know I can't take it back, but I want you to know I regret it. I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in his apologies. Words didn't mean anything to me. I'd spent 4 years rebuilding my life from nothing because of his lies, and no amount of sorry was going to change that. After he left, I called Jake to let him know what had happened. Jake thought I was crazy for even considering helping Eric. Dude, the guy ruined your life, he said. And now you're going to bail him out? You're a better person than me, that's for sure. It's not about him, I said. It's about that little girl. She doesn't deserve to pay for his mistakes. Even as I said it, I wasn't sure if that was the whole truth. Yeah, I wanted to help the girl, but part of me also wanted to see Eric squirm. I wanted him to stand in front of the family he'd lied to and admit what he'd done. I wanted them to see the truth about the golden boy they'd chosen over me. Eric texted me a few days later to say he'd set up the meeting for the weekend. Everyone's going to be there, he wrote. Mom, Dad, the grandparents, aunts, uncles, all of them. I couldn't deny the knot in my stomach when I read that message. I hadn't seen any of them since the day Paul kicked me out. But this was my chance to finally clear my name, to get the truth out there once and for all. So here where I am right now, everything keeps replaying in my head. The accusations, the lies, the years of being treated like the scapegoat. I don't know how the family's going to react when Eric confesses. And honestly, I don't care. This isn't about their forgiveness. It's about finally getting the truth out there. For me. I'll let you all know how it goes once it's done. Stay tuned. Final update. Hey guys, so just like I promised, here's the update. So, the family meeting was scheduled for Saturday. And let me tell you, the whole week leading up to it was a mental marathon. It wasn't just about making my stepbrother confess. It was about walking into a room full of people who had believed him over me for 4 years. People who didn't even bother questioning his lies. I have no idea how they're going to react. And honestly, I couldn't care less. This isn't about fixing relationships. It's about getting the closure I've been waiting for. When I pulled up to my mom and Paul's house, I almost didn't get out of the car. It had been 4 years since I'd last been there, and everything about the place felt like a bad memory. The driveway where Paul had yelled at me to leave, the front door my mom didn't stop me from walking out of, it all came flooding back. If it wasn't for Jake sitting in the passenger seat, I might have turned around and left. Are you sure about this? Jake asked. He wasn't trying to stop me, just making sure I was ready. Yeah, I said. Let's get it over with. When we walked in, the house looked exactly the same. Except for one thing, all the photos with me in them were gone. That stung more than I expected. It was like they'd erased me completely, like I'd never even been part of the family. Everyone was already there, packed into the living room. My mom, Paul, Eric, his grandparents, aunts, uncles, you name it. My mom's face lit up when she saw me, and she immediately burst into tears. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back. I'm not here for that, I said. Let's just get this over with. Paul looked uncomfortable, like he didn't know how to react. He opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off. Don't bother, I said. I'm here to hear Eric tell the truth and leave. That's it. Eric looked like he wanted to disappear. He was sweating, fidgeting, and avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Twice he glanced at me like he was hoping I'd change my mind and let him off the hook. I didn't say a word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eric started talking. He stumbled over his words at first, mumbling something about how he'd made mistakes and let everyone down. Paul tried to jump in and reassure him, but I wasn't having it. No, I said. You tell them the truth. All of it. And he did. Slowly, painfully, Eric laid it all out. He told them how he'd blown the college fund during his gap year, partying, buying junk, and going on trips. He explained how he'd panicked when Paul found out the money was gone and decided to blame me because he knew Paul would believe him. He admitted to faking the emails, planting the USB drive, and lying about seeing me snooping in the office. The room was dead silent by the time he finished. Paul looked like someone had slapped him. His parents, Eric's grandparents, were crying, probably realizing they'd funded all of Eric's screw-ups. My aunts and uncles were staring at Eric like they didn't even know who he was. But I wasn't paying attention to any of them. I was watching my mom. Her face was a mix of shock, guilt, and heartbreak. She kept shaking her head, whispering no under her breath, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I thought I'd feel satisfaction seeing her finally realize the truth, but instead it just felt empty. When Eric was done, I stood up and pulled out my phone. I'd already set up the hospital transfer in advance, so all I had to do was hit send. I showed him the confirmation screen and said, "The money's there. Mia will get her surgery. We're done here." That's when my mom broke down. "Alex, please," she said, grabbing my arm. "I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I failed you. Please don't leave like this." Paul tried to jump in too. "Alex, I don't know what to say. I was wrong. I'll write you a check for double the college fund. Whatever it takes to make this right." Even Eric tried to apologize. He was crying by this point, saying he'd spend the rest of his life trying to make it up to me. "I know I ruined everything," he said, "but thank you for helping Mia. I'll never forget this." I just looked at all of them. My mom, who had chosen to stay silent when I needed her most, Paul, who had thrown me out without a second thought, and Eric, the person who had taken everything from me. 4 years ago, I would have given anything to hear their apologies. Now, they meant nothing. I yanked my arm out of my mom's grip, shot her a cold glare, and walked out without a single word or glance back. Jake followed me, and we drove back to my place in silence. When we got there, he finally broke the tension. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. And for the first time in years, I meant it. Since then, I've gone completely no contact with my family. I blocked their numbers, their emails, and even their social media accounts. My mom has been sending me long, emotional emails every day, talking about how she cries herself to sleep and how much she misses me. Paul has sent multiple checks, first for $80,000, then for $160,000, to make up for the pain and interest. I mailed them back without a second thought. Eric's grandparents have even shown up at my office a few times, but security knows to turn them away. They leave letters saying how sorry they are and how they feel responsible for everything because they'd spoiled Eric and let him get away with too much. I don't care. They believed him when it mattered, and that's all I need to know. I heard through Jake that Mia's surgery was a success. She's recovering well, and I'm genuinely happy for her. She's innocent in all of this, and I hope she grows up to be nothing like her dad. As for Eric, he apparently moved back in with his mom in another state. His ex-wife won't let him see Mia without supervision, and he's been struggling to hold down a job. I'd be lying if I said I felt bad for him. As for me, I'm thriving. I got another promotion at work and just put a down payment on a house in Seattle. My company's opening a new office there, and I'll be heading it up. It feels good to keep moving forward, leaving all the toxicity behind. Sometimes people tell me I should forgive my family, especially my mom. She was in a tough spot, they say. She didn't know what to believe. But sorry doesn't erase 4 years of betrayal. Sorry doesn't give me back the family I lost, the trust that was shattered, or the years I spent rebuilding my life alone. Some bridges just aren't worth rebuilding. They say the best revenge is living well. And let me tell you, I'm doing just fine. Thanks for reading, Alex.